Our next speaker is Audrey Werner. He is the Dean of Life Issues and Professor at Masters International University of Divinity. She's a former sex educator and STD clinic nurse for Life Talk Pregnancy Center. And she comes to us from Dallas. So thank you for making the trek down here. And she will overwhelm you with incredibly insightful information as well. So thanks for being here, Audrey.
Thank you. It's ironic that 20 and a half years ago, I was serving on a curriculum review committee on sex education in a Lutheran school. And I had to get up for 15 minutes and talk about why I thought their Christian sex ed program was bad and had a bad foundation. And little did I know, 20 and a half years later, that I would be standing up here to do 15 minutes to you, and I'm very honored by that. Let me share with you, I do not have my slides in front of me right now, so I will kind of look up inside. They're back home. But I can kind of do this in my sleep. My background is I was a sex educator for 5 years. It was through the public health department. We were school nurses, so as part of our job, we went in and talked to the kids about sex. We were told parents aren't doing their job, so you got to go in there and do it for them. I thought, okay, at that point I was newly married, didn't have any children, and I thought, I could do this. I can help out parents. And they said, you're going to hear this lie out there that if you go and talk to kids about sex, that you're going to increase the pregnancy rate and the STD rate, and that's just simply not true. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do this. So I did that for 5 years, and then we were blessed with our first child. Pardon me? Yeah, I can see it. Blessed with our first child, and I wanted to work still for the health department, but I wanted to work part-time. Well, the only part-time job available was working in the STD clinic. I really don't want to do genital exams on people, but okay, if that's getting me to stay home with my baby and still work at the health department, I'll do it. So I did it, and it's as if the Lord said, I want you to see the fruit of your labor. And that is where my eyes were open. This is what I viewed. We were talking about what happened, and this is my view from an STD nurse. And I'm going to call it sexually transmitted disease because we've changed it to infection because, gosh, everybody gets infections and you can just put a Band-Aid on that and that's not a problem. Whereas a disease is a problem and we need to address it. So what I saw was when I started in 1991, typical age of first sexual contact would have been 16 or 17. That was very, very common. By the time I left in 1999, it was not uncommon to hear 10 years old being first sexual contact. Now, I'm not saying that's consensual, but that was not uncommon. Something else that we, believe it or not, back in 1991, there still was shame and guilt associated with having sex outside of marriage. And then by 1999, no shame and guilt whatsoever. The other thing we noticed, very interesting, in the mid-1990s, we saw date rape explode. And I thought, where is this coming from? Am I the only nurse that's seeing this? And all the other nurses said, no, we're seeing this. Well, I saw a documentary on pornography about 10 years later, and during the Clinton administration, they had taken all the restrictions off the porn industry, and that's the first time we saw the first big explosion in pornography. And I know some states are passing where it's a public health crisis. I can tell you from the STD nurse perspective, we saw the direct correlation between pornography exposure and date rape. There is a direct correlation between them. The other thing that we did was, of course, as an AIDS counselor, I was the one who had to tell somebody for the first time that they were HIV positive. Now, obviously, most of the time I did that with gay men, but there were a few times when, toward 1999, we were telling teen girls that they were HIV positive. Something that we do in the STD clinic is if there's an alleged rapist, he is ordered by the judge to come in and get an HIV test. So we would then have to test him. Now, HIV results are so confidential, you cannot share that with their partner, anyone else. This is the one time if they're caught, if they're found guilty of that crime, you can share those results with the victim. Now, when we started this, we were doing this test on adult men. By the time I left, and I know you had talked about children raping children, we were doing this test on 10-year-old boys who had raped 2- and 4-year-old girls. And clearly we saw there's a problem. It's getting worse. And I think the thing for my husband was a youth pastor, and he was dealing with the teenagers as well. And I think the thing that bothered both of us was there was no difference between the Christian kid and the non-Christian kid. Something's going on. So as the researcher, I wanted to know, why is this not getting better? Why is this getting worse? So I want you to look at these graphs. This is STD rates for gonorrhea, ages 10 to 14. You're going to notice across the board, it's very, very low. Look at the years there. Something happened in 62, 63, 64, and then we see an explosion. This is national statistics, by the way. Go to the next slide. Birth rates to unwed girls, 15 to 19 years old. Again, 62, 63, 64. Something happened in that time. Next slide. Pregnancies to unwed girls under the age of 15. And again, then when we factor in abortion becoming legal and factor in that statistic as well, we see an explosion of STDs and pregnancy. And then what happened to the American family after that? It started to fall apart.
Wow.
There's a direct correlation between that. And as you can see, what I was seeing in the 90s was true. It was getting worse. Go to the next slide. My oldest son serves in the U.S. Coast Guard. He's in a remote place in Alaska, and he just had our very first grandchild. Got married a year and a half ago, or 2 years ago, and now we have our new grandchild. Of course, as a grandma, I have to get up to Alaska and see. And so in a flight, and of course in a remote area, it takes several hours to get up there. So I was half awake. We've been flying all night. We're coming out of Seattle, and we finally come above the clouds, and I go, wow! I said, that has got to be a huge mountain. We're just seeing the tip of that mountain, but that's got to be a huge mountain. Of course, duh, it's Mount St. Helens is what I saw, but I was not awake enough to figure out what it was at first. That's what it's like with sex education. I started to want to know, what is the root? What is behind? What happened in 62, 63, 64? What, have we always had sex ed? Who developed it? What was the intent behind sex education? So that's what this is like looking at. You're looking at a huge mountain. We're just giving you the tip. Yeah. And I now teach courses to pastors, biblical counselors, crisis pregnancy staff all over the world on that big mountain. So go ahead. So let's look historically. Prior to 1948, sex knowledge was never important for kids, ever. If you look to the theorists, Piaget, Manslow, Skinner, you'll see that they looked at individual and group skills such as learning to reason, submitting to authority, moral thinking, task achievement, self-actualization, mutual cooperation, and social interaction were a child's major developmental objectives. We never, ever thought of talking to kids about sex. Go to the next slide. Historically, and I bought a lot of antique books too, because I want to know, what did they do back then? So I found a lot of books. There was one, How Should I Tell My Child? And it was written in 1912. Parents were the primary educators, and when they talked about God's life process, they talked about it in a very indirect, modest way. That's why you hear the flowers, the birds, and the bees. That's what they used to talk to their kids. Or if you were on the farm, of course, you saw the farm animals. But it was always in an indirect way. It was never done in a graphic, upfront way. Actually, if you look to the state laws, it was considered molesting a minor with immoral intent to even mention the word sexual intercourse in the classroom up to the age of 21. Wow. We've come a long way, baby, in such a short period of time. So, what changed all of this? What happened? I found a man by the name of Alfred Kinsey. He was a catalyst for the sex education that we now have in our schools today. Well, who was this guy? I had heard about him in nursing school. I had heard the phrase, children are sexual from birth. That came from this guy. He was a zoologist at Indiana University. He studied the sexual behavior of a gall wasp. The media portrayed him as a happily married man, but in actuality, with biographies that have come out from his own associates, he was a homosexual sadomasochist, and he advocated for all sexual rights. He believed infants should be able to have sex as well as the elderly, all through. He published his first, he did sex research, and he published his studies. In 1948, he did sexual behavior in the human male. This is in every university. This is in every library, as if it was gospel truth. But if you look closely at his data, For the male data, he went into the prisons and he interviewed the most sexually deviant criminal, and he said this is the typical sexual behavior of the American male. For the females, he went and interviewed prostitutes. If they lived with a man for more than a year, he said this was the typical sexual behavior of the American married female. Now for the child data, back it up for 1 second. For the children's data, I'll show that in the next slide, but it's important that you understand, he was the first one to say children are sexual from birth, meaning infancy. Go to the next slide. And then click it again, the table should come up. Okay, so I said, okay, Lord, I know nothing about Kinsey. And the Lord said, okay, you want Kinsey? I'm going to give you the #1 expert in the world. She has testified at the Supreme Court level, at House of Parliament. She's been all over the world, Dr. Judith Reisman. And she looked at this book as well. And in the book, I have it right here. It was very interesting carrying this around trying to hide it, but people are like, the printer almost didn't print it because she looked at it horrified. What this is his childhood data. He documented how many orgasms does a child have in a 24-hour period of time. And if you look at the ages, we're starting at 5 months of age up through 14 years of age. So you're talking about children who have been raped for a 24-hour period of time. That's the foundation of sex ed. That's the foundation of sex ed. Huge to understand that. And there's one poor child, a 4-year-old, who had 26 orgasms in a 24-hour period of time. So let's go to the next slide, because how did he describe that? Judith found herself on some interesting places. In 1990, she was on the Phil Donahue show, sitting next to Kinsey's associates. And Phil asked one of his associates about that data. And his associate, Clarence Tripp, said, oh, no. He listened to only pedophiles who were very careful, used stopwatches, knew how to record their thing. Now, if you look in this book, how does Kinsey describe a child having an orgasm? Sobbing, sometimes with an abundance of tears, especially among younger children, afflicted with extreme trembling, collapse, and sometimes fainting. Kinsey wrote that the children enjoy the experience, though many fight away the partner, not the perpetrator, the partner.
Oh, gosh.
This is the foundation of sex education. Next slide. So, remember 62, 63, 64. What happened in the Supreme Court case, 1962, real quick?
Prayer removed.
Prayer removed from school. 1963, what happened? Bible reading room. 1964, this is by no accident, people. 1964, SIECUS, which was the Sex Information Education Council of the United States, which was the official beginning of sex education, was launched at the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University. The objective was to teach Kinsey's ideology, because remember, children are sexual from birth, so we're going to teach them how to handle their sexuality. The first leader for SIECUS was Dr. Mary Calderon. Guess what? Who was she? She was the medical director of Planned Parenthood. You've heard that name a lot today. Then the initial seed money. Guess where that came from? Hugh Hefner gave the initial seed money, with many people that were serving on the curriculum boards for sex education were employed by Penthouse Forum. Gosh, why would the largest abortion industry and pornography industry want to be at the heart of sex education for our children? Do they make money off of that? Absolutely. So, SIECUS leaders supported humanism, communism, and eugenics, and they promoted their ideas through sex education. The technique that they used was called SAR, or sexual attitude restructuring, which again, instead of the flower, the birds, and the bees, we're going to take them to the act and the genitals, and it's gone way beyond that. Next slide. So we had to get all the sex, I had to go through training to be able to teach sex education in the schools. And the training had to be standardized, so everybody across the country has to have the same training in order to teach sex ed. So they had to have an organization to start to train, and that was the American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. And it was created in 1967 to train everybody to be on the same page. And this is what their job was: to provide sex information to the sex educator, train him or her in the psychotherapy technique necessary to communicate this knowledge, and to restructure his or her sexual values so as to equip him or her to expand their students' tolerance and acceptance of variant sexual practices and lifestyles. So, again, this was all set up. We've all been lied to and deceived. Next slide. When the late Alan Guttmacher, he was the, signed on to the Humanist Manifesto. He was the Planned Parenthood president. And he was asked after Roe versus Wade, how can we make sure that that Supreme Court decision stays secure? He answered with 2 words, sex education. So, in summary, sex education was never designed to prevent STDs or pregnancy. It was designed to prepare children to have sex with each other and to have sex with adults. So when we look at that, we understand that at the core of sex education is a man who interviewed pedophiles who raped hundreds of children and sees no problem and thinks it's healthy for an infant to have sex with an adult. We have Planned Parenthood, which is the #1 abortion industry in the world, and we have the pornography industry.
Wow.
So, I am speaking to one of the planks that was passed at the Republican convention this last summer. So I'm asking for the whole enchilada. I'm asking for no sex education in the schools.
Thank you, Audrey, that was incredible, and we applaud your passion, and thank you for your expertise and insight.